Imagine two of America's most respected scientists hiring armed guards, sabotaging each other's dig sites, and literally dynamiting fossil beds to prevent their rival from finding dinosaur bones. Picture academic colleagues spreading vicious lies about each other in newspapers, bribing workers to steal specimens, and turning the pursuit of scientific knowledge into a battlefield that would make the Wild West look civilized. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of the Bone Wars, the most destructive and toxic scientific rivalry in American history, a conflict that started with the discovery of dinosaurs and ended with careers destroyed, friendships shattered, and irreplaceable scientific specimens blown to pieces out of pure spite. Welcome to the dark side of paleontology, where two brilliant men allowed their egos to transform the noble pursuit of knowledge into a war that would set American science back by decades. Let me take you back to the 1870s, to an America that was obsessed with dinosaurs and the two men whose hatred for each other would nearly destroy an entire field of study. The year is 1858. Charles Darwin has just published On the Origin of Species, and the world is grappling with revolutionary new ideas about evolution and prehistoric life. In America, the discovery of massive fossil bones in the Western territories has captured the public imagination like nothing before. These weren't just old bones. These were the remains of creatures so enormous and alien that they challenged everything people thought they knew about the history of life on Earth. Newspapers were calling it the American Dinosaur Rush, and suddenly paleontology became the most exciting and prestigious field in science. Into this world stepped two men who would become the central figures in our story, Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. Both were brilliant paleontologists, both were wealthy enough to fund massive expeditions, and both were absolutely convinced that they were destined to become the greatest fossil hunter in American history. At first, they were actually friends. Marsh was a professor at Yale University, a meticulous researcher with unlimited funding thanks to his wealthy uncle, George Peabody. He was methodical, careful, and had access to the best equipment and facilities money could buy. Cope was 8 years younger, a prodigy who had published his first scientific paper at age 19. He was passionate, intuitive, and had an almost supernatural ability to reconstruct entire prehistoric creatures from just a few bone fragments. He worked faster than anyone in the field and had already discovered dozens of new species by his early 30s. In the beginning, they collaborated. They shared information, visited each other's dig sites, and even named species after each other as a sign of mutual respect. Cope named a prehistoric reptile Ptyonius marshi in honor of his colleague, and Marsh returned the favor. But then came the incident that would ignite one of the most vicious feuds in scientific history. In 1868, Cope invited Marsh to visit his dig site in New Jersey, where he had discovered what he believed to be a new species of marine reptile called Elasmosaurus. Cope was incredibly proud of this find, and had already published papers describing the creature. Marsh examined the fossil reconstruction and made a discovery that would change everything. Cope had assembled the skeleton backwards. He had put the skull on the tail end of the creature, making it look like a bizarre prehistoric monster with a head where its tail should be. Now here's where personalities came into play. A tactful scientist might have quietly pulled Cope aside and gently pointed out the error. A diplomatic colleague might have framed it as an interesting alternative interpretation worth discussing. Marsh did neither of these things. Instead, he publicly humiliated Cope at a scientific meeting, pointing out the error in front of dozens of their peers and essentially calling Cope incompetent. To make matters worse, Marsh then published a paper correcting Cope's mistake, claiming credit for the proper reconstruction. Cope was mortified. Here was his most celebrated discovery, turned into a public embarrassment by someone he had considered a friend. The humiliation was made worse by the fact that Marsh was technically correct, which meant Cope had no scientific grounds to defend himself. This single incident transformed two collaborating scientists into bitter enemies. But what happened next turned their personal animosity into a war that would consume both their lives and nearly destroy American paleontology. The western United States in the 1870s was a paleontologist's paradise. The badlands of Wyoming, Colorado, and Montana were filled with exposed fossil beds containing dinosaur bones, unlike anything ever discovered. These weren't just individual specimens. These were entire graveyards of prehistoric creatures waiting to be unearthed. Both Marsh and Cope realized that whoever controlled these fossil beds would essentially control the future of paleontology. They would be the ones to name new species, publish groundbreaking papers, and cement their legacy as the greatest dinosaur hunter in history. The competition began innocently enough. Both men started funding expeditions to the Western Territories, hiring crews of workers to excavate fossils and ship them back east for study. They competed to see who could discover the most new species, who could find the biggest specimens, and who could generate the most newspaper headlines. But as the stakes grew higher, the methods became increasingly underhanded. It started with espionage. Marsh began bribing workers at Cope's dig sites to report on what they were finding. Cope retaliated by sending spies to infiltrate Marsh's expeditions. Soon, both men had networks of informants keeping tabs on their rivals' activities. Then came the sabotage. Workers loyal to one scientist would vandalize the other's equipment, steal specimens, or provide false information about promising dig sites. Fossils that took weeks to carefully excavate would mysteriously disappear in the middle of the night, only to show up in their rival's collection. The conflict escalated when both men started hiring armed guards to protect their dig sites. These weren't just security guards. These were professional gunfighters, the kind of men you'd expect to see in a saloon shootout, not at a scientific excavation. The fossil beds of the American West became literal battlegrounds, with paleontologists directing armed camps of workers in a struggle for prehistoric bones. Newspaper reporters began following the expeditions, and the Bone Wars became a national sensation. Americans were fascinated by the idea of scientists behaving like Wild West outlaws, and the press played up every conflict, every discovery, and every accusation. Marsh and Cope quickly learned that public opinion could be as valuable as actual fossils, and they both became masters of scientific propaganda. They would rush to publish discoveries before they had been properly studied, just to claim priority over their rival. They would make grandiose claims about their finds in newspaper interviews, often exaggerating the size and importance of their specimens. But the real destruction came when they started targeting each other's reputations. Cope began publishing a series of papers pointing out errors in Marsh's work, questioning his methodology, and suggesting that his rival was incompetent. Marsh retaliated by using his position at Yale and his connections in the scientific establishment to block Cope's papers from being published in major journals. The personal attacks became increasingly vicious. Marsh accused Cope of being a fraud who stole other people's discoveries. Cope accused Marsh of being a lazy aristocrat who took credit for his assistant's work. They questioned each other's integrity, their scientific competence, and their right to call themselves paleontologists. The scientific community watched in horror as two of their most prominent members destroyed their own reputations in pursuit of revenge against each other. But the real tragedy was what was happening to the fossils themselves. In their desperation to prevent their rival from accessing valuable specimens, both men began employing increasingly destructive tactics. If they couldn't remove a fossil bed completely, they would dynamite it to make it worthless to their opponent. Entire sites filled with irreplaceable scientific specimens were blown up and scattered, rather than allowed to fall into enemy hands. Workers were instructed to destroy anything they couldn't take with them. Fossils that had survived for millions of years were shattered with hammers, covered with rocks, or deliberately damaged to prevent their rival from studying them. The waste was staggering. Paleontologists estimate that more fossil specimens were destroyed during the Bone Wars than were preserved. Entire species that could have revolutionized our understanding of prehistoric life were lost forever, because two men couldn't control their hatred for each other. Meanwhile, the quality of their scientific work began to suffer dramatically. In their rush to beat each other to publication, both men started making serious errors. They would name the same species multiple times, create new classifications based on incomplete specimens, and publish contradictory findings without proper peer review. Cope alone described over 1,000 new species during this period, many based on just a few bone fragments. Modern paleontologists estimate that at least half of these classifications were incorrect, creating decades of confusion in the field. Marsh wasn't much better. His famous reconstruction of a brontosaurus, which became one of the most iconic dinosaur images in popular culture, was later discovered to be completely wrong. He had combined the body of one dinosaur with the skull of a completely different species, creating a creature that never actually existed. The irony was devastating. The same mistake that had started their feud, Cope's backwards Elasmosaurus, was being repeated by both men on a massive scale as their rivalry consumed their scientific judgment. The conflict reached its peak in 1890, when Cope made a desperate gamble to destroy Marsh once and for all. He had been collecting evidence of Marsh's scientific errors and ethical violations for years, and he decided to make it all public. Cope published a massive expose in the New York Herald, accusing Marsh of fraud, incompetence, and corruption. He claimed that Marsh had stolen specimens, published false data, and used his position at Yale to suppress rival scientists. The article was front-page news and caused a national scandal. Marsh responded with his own series of articles, detailing Cope's mistakes and questioning his mental stability. He suggested that his rival was suffering from some kind of psychological breakdown and couldn't be trusted to conduct legitimate scientific research. The public mudslinging became so intense that the U.S. government was forced to intervene. Congress actually held hearings to investigate the allegations both men were making against each other. The spectacle of two prominent scientists airing their personal grievances before a congressional committee was unprecedented and deeply embarrassing for the entire scientific community. In the end, both men were found to have committed serious ethical violations. Marsh lost his government funding and was effectively forced out of active fieldwork. Cope's reputation was so damaged that he couldn't secure funding for major expeditions and spent his final years working alone on small projects. The Bone Wars officially ended not with a victor, but with mutual destruction. Both men had accomplished their goal of ruining their rival's career, but they had also ruined their own lives in the process. Cope died in 1897, relatively young and bitter about how his career had ended. Even on his deathbed, he was still plotting revenge against Marsh, reportedly arranging for his own skull to be donated to science so that future researchers could measure it and prove that his brain was larger than Marsh's. Marsh lived until 1899, but his final years were marked by isolation and professional irrelevance. The man who had once been America's most celebrated paleontologist died largely forgotten, his contributions overshadowed by the damage he had done to his own field. The aftermath of the Bone Wars was devastating for American paleontology. Public confidence in the field was shattered, government funding was slashed, and many promising young scientists chose other careers rather than enter a field associated with such toxic behavior. It took decades for paleontology to recover from the damage. The next generation of scientists had to rebuild the field's reputation almost from scratch, establishing new ethical standards and working to restore public trust in scientific research. But perhaps the most tragic loss was the specimens themselves. Modern paleontologists still discover the remains of fossils that were damaged or destroyed during the Bone Wars. Every few years, someone finds fragments of bones that were scattered by time, or discovers evidence of sites that were deliberately destroyed to prevent rivals from accessing them. We'll never know what scientific breakthroughs were lost when those fossil beds were blown up out of spite. We'll never see the complete skeletons that were broken apart and scattered. We'll never understand the prehistoric ecosystems that could have been reconstructed if the specimens had been preserved instead of destroyed. The Bone Wars teach us several important lessons about human nature, scientific ethics, and the dangers of unchecked competition. First, they show how personal ego can corrupt even the most noble pursuits. Both Marsh and Cope started with genuine passion for scientific discovery, but their need to be recognized as the greatest in their field ultimately mattered more to them than the actual advancement of knowledge.